Hello everyone, this week's Parsha is Parsha Beshalach. Many of these ideas I heard from Rav Bernstein in his 2013 shiur. I posted it below. It's well worth listening to it, even if you hear this dvar Torah. But we'll go on. So, the Jewish people are out, amazingly, and one of the key features of leaving Mitzrayim was the fact that the Jewish people did not go directly to Eretz Yisrael. Right? We did not go to Eretz Canaan immediately. We took an indirect route. Now, we see this in the first pasuk. We'll just go right into it. It's literally the first pasuk of this parsha. It's chapter 13, verse 17, and it says as follows. It happened when Pharaoh sent out the people that... I'm reading in English just for the sake of speed. It happened when Pharaoh sent out the people that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines because it was near. For God said, perhaps the people will reconsider when they see a war, and they will return to Egypt. So God is worried about the Jewish people making a beeline to Mitzrayim. When would they do that? When they see a war. Which war? So that's actually Machloket Rishonim, right? It's a dispute among our earlier authorities. They lived between the years about 900 to 1500, and there's a dispute. But it's a common understanding that the war we're talking about is the war of entering Eretz Canaan. That is to say, warring against the indigenous populations in Eretz Canaan. That's what one might have worried the Jewish people. What would their reaction have been? Beelining back to Mitzrayim. So as a result, the way God responded to this issue was just having them take an indirect route. Now, the reason why that's a problem is because it seems like we're not really addressing the root of the problem, which is the fact that Bnei Israel are afraid to go into Eretz Canaan. Instead, what are we doing? We're just sending them in such a way so that once they get to Eretz Canaan and they're confronted by it, we could ask them, well, hey, are you still afraid? And they'll say, yes, we are. But they're not going to go back to Eretz Mitzrayim because now they have this long, tedious journey to get back to Eretz Mitzrayim. And therefore, weighing the options between going back to Mitzrayim or just going into the land and confronting your fears, well, it seems like we're just going to say they'll just go into Eretz Mitzrayim. Sorry, they're going to go into Eretz Canaan, and that's that. And the problem has been solved. And that is a legitimate approach. That's the approach of the Rashbam. That's the grandson of Rashi. He's one of the famous Balei Tosfot in the Gemara. So that is certainly Shita. But there are other opinions that say no. This was not circumventing the issue. Rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was confronting the issue of their fear head on by having them go through the Yam Suf, and that's how they're going to confront their fear. Now, how do we see this? So there's a pasuk in Tehillim that talks about Kriyat Yam Suf, and it says, "Legozer Yam Suf legazarim." We say this in Kila Olam Chasto, right? We say this in the Pesach Haggadah. We say this every Shabbat. I think it's Tehillim 36, Lamed Vav. Legozer Yam Suf legazarim. So the Midrash on this pasuk says the following. What does that mean? It means that God cut Yam Suf into strips. How so? In that there are 12 Shvatim of Bnei Israel. So the way we normally think of Kriyat Yam Suf is that there was a single body of water, and then God split it into two, and there was one path, and the entire Bnei Israel went through that one path. This Midrash is saying, no. The fact that the pasuk in Tehillim is saying, "Legozer Yam Suf legazarim," thank you God for cutting the Yam Suf into strips. Two is not strips. Rather, multiple are strips. How many multiples? 13 apparently, because there are 12 pathways that the Jewish people walked through in order to cross Yam Suf, because it was one for each Shevet. Okay, so this is a very famous Midrash, right? The fact that Yam Suf was split, there is one path for each Shevet, but astonishingly, we rarely stop to think and ask ourselves, why? Why was it necessary to cut Yam Suf into 12 different pathways so that each Shevet could have their own path to cross Yam Suf? What was the significance about that? What was so important about that? What is being symbolized through that way of splitting the Yam Suf? So this is a question that's asked by Rav Shlomo Fischer. I'm pretty sure he's still living, Baruch Hashem. He's a great Talmid Chacham. He lives in Yerushalayim, and he answers this question. He asks this question, and he answers it. So we'll be looking at his answer, and he says as follows. He says, what was achieved at Kriyat Yam Suf? What happened at Kriyat Yam Suf? So there's more than one thing. The immediate answers are, of course, this is the end of the Geula, right? This is the completion of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So that's one thing. A second thing is this is the final judgment for the Mitzrayim, right? This is their final din, being crushed in the Yam Suf. So as a result, between these two things, this really seems to be the culmination of the Geula. And this is there are four expressions of Geula. They're at the beginning of Va'era. Maybe we could just see them real quick. See if we can find it. I think it's V'otzeti, V'galti. Yeah, here we go. So it says, we're looking at Parashat Va'era in chapter 6, verse 6. V'otzeti etchem mitachat tzivlot Mitzrayim, v'yitzalti etchem me'avodotam, v'ga'alti etchem mizrah netoya v'shvatim gedolim, v'lakachti etchem, etc. So the v'ga'alti here, that is represented by the Yam Suf. That is to say, the fact that the Yam Suf came back with the Egyptians and crushed them. That is being represented here. So this is the completion of the Geula. Regardless, there's undisputed that the Kriyat Yam Suf was a very significant, momentous, and incredibly important event for Yetziat Mitzrayim, for exiting Egypt. But it has other factors. There are other things going on by Kriyat Yam Suf, and this is going to help us understand what the significance of it is. Now, the reverberations from Kriyat Yam Suf well beyond the fact that Bnei Israel went through it. Now, what are they? So if we look at Sefer Yoshua, right, when Yoshua sends two Meraglim into Eretz Yisrael, who are these two Meraglim? They're Kalev ben Yefuneh, right, one of the original Meraglim, as well as Pinchas, who had proven his mettle. And we go to chapter 2, verse 9. So the Meraglim went into Rachav's house, and it says, and I'm just going to read it in English. So it says as follows. Again, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away because of you. Okay, well, why? The next pasuk, verse 10 says, for we have heard how the Lord had dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. That is unbelievable. That happened 40 years ago, and still the people of Canaan have not recovered from it. Just hearing about it just stunned them so deeply and scared them so profoundly that their hearts have melted. But then the puzzle goes on and says, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you completely destroyed. That was like last year, from the time that Rachav is speaking to Kalev and Pinchas. And yet, the first thing that she mentions is the Kriyat Yam Suf. That's unbelievable. And in the very next pasuk it says, and as soon as we heard, our hearts melted. Wow. So that really seems to change things. Because originally, if we would have thought of anything that Rachav would have mentioned, it would have been the 10 plagues. Or if not the 10 plagues, then at least the most recent, like totally crushing military defeat that happened to the people of Canaan's neighbors. But that's not the first thing she mentioned. The first thing she mentioned was the fact of Kriyat Yam Suf. That somehow was greater than all of the others. And by the way, this really seems to corroborate a well-known midrash that says that Kriyat Yam Suf was experienced globally. The way we see that, just quickly diverting, is if we go into chapter 14, verse 21. Well, again, we'll just read it in English. So as it says, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Hashem moved the sea with a strong east wind all the night, and he turned the sea to dry land, and the water split. Now, the anomaly here that is going to provoke Rashi into commenting is the fact that it says, and he, as in Hashem, turned the sea to dry land, and the water split. So really, the verse should be flipped. It should say, and the water split, and he turned the sea to dry land. But it doesn't say that. It says first dry land, and then the water split. So what does Rashi have to say about this? It says, V'yibaku hamayim kol mayim sheba'olam. All the waters everywhere in the world. So that for those people who were standing in the kitchen, they watched the water in their kitchen split. And then eventually, when they heard about this Kriyat Yam Suf a few days or a few weeks or even a few months later, then suddenly they're like, "Oh my gosh, that's what happened! I remember when that happened in my own kitchen." And therefore, this seems to corroborate the fact that this really was experienced worldwide. Okay, so we know that Kriyat Yam Suf had an impact, but it was more than that. Not only were other people afraid of Bnei Israel as a result of Kriyat Yam Suf, but Bnei Israel themselves had a different self-image, having left the Yam Suf. Because their Egyptian overseers, who there still had memories of them and were still frightened of them, what happened when Bnei Israel exited from Yam Suf? Here they see that their overseers dead, lying on the bank of the Yam Suf. That allowed Bnei Israel to emerge in an entirely different light. Therefore, says Rav Fischer, one could say that amongst all the other things that Kriyat Yam Suf was, it was also the first step in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. This was the first move against the indigenous population of Eretz Yisrael. It's true that there was no military conflict, but morale is everything. Kriyat Yam Suf and the effect that it had on the people of Canaan was the first attack on that land. And therefore, says Rav Fischer, that when the pasuk at the beginning of our parasha says, it happened when Pharaoh sent out the people that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, because it was near. For God said, perhaps the people will reconsider when they see a war, and they will return to Egypt. So God turned the people toward the way of the wilderness, to the Sea of Reeds. This isn't God circumventing the issue. It was Him confronting it head on. That is to say, the Jewish people are currently afraid to enter Eretz Canaan. They're afraid to go to war. That's making them worried. So when He redirects them and has Bnei Israel take a different route in order to get to Canaan, it's not that He's trying to prevent Bnei Israel having an exit to beeline back to Egypt. Rather, He's confronting this issue head on. That is to say, if they go straight, they'll stay afraid. But if they go through the Yam Suf, they will become unafraid, and they will be ready. And this, by the way, gives us an entirely different perspective of what happened with the Meraglim. That is to say, the Meraglim went into Eretz Yisrael, and they saw what they saw, and they reported what they reported, and they said that their report effectively melted the hearts of the Jewish people. But if they had simply spoken to the people of Canaan, then they would have seen and heard that people were afraid of Bnei Israel. After all, there are two expeditions, right? There were the 12 Meraglim. They bore the false report, and then later on, Yehoshua sent Caleb and Pinchas. Caleb and Pinchas actually spoke to some of the natives to hear what they had to say. And what did they say? They said, "V'yimas levavenu," our hearts melted. We were terrified. But the fact is, the Meraglim did not do this, and the fact that they didn't do it prevented the Meraglim from potentially getting a bit more confidence in their capabilities to conquer Eretz Canaan. And perhaps that would have changed Jewish history. Just as an aside, that's my extra note, the fact that it may have changed Jewish history. The point is if they had simply spoken to the natives, then that would have potentially given them more confidence, and that would have changed their report, hopefully. Now, says Rav Fischer, this idea is also corroborated through Tehillim. That is to say, there's Tehillim Kufa He and Kufav, 105 and 106. Now, they both detail the history of Bnei Israel from the beginning until the entry into Eretz Canaan. Now, Rav Fischer points out that they're divided in a very interesting way. 105, Kuf He, talks about the 10 Makot. Kuf Vav talks about Kriyat Yam Suf and entry into Eretz Canaan. That's an amazing divide. The more intuitive divide would have simply to have divided the 10 Makot with Kriyat Yam Suf, that's the Yetziat Mitzrayim, and eventually Eretz Canaan into Kuf Vav. But that's not the way it does it. And the reason why is because that bears out the understanding that Kriyat Yam Suf was the first step into entering Eretz Canaan. And that's why Kriyat Yam Suf is in the same Tehillim as entering Eretz Yisrael and is not grouped with the 10 Makot. So, says Rav Fischer, as a conclusion to this concept, the idea of dividing Bnei Israel into their Shvatim generally pertains to their destiny in Eretz Yisrael. That is where their Nachla is, according to their Shevet. They're counted Lefi Shevet as a prelude to their entry to Eretz Canaan. So you can understand why when they entered the Yam Suf, they went through Leshivtehem, because going through the Yam Suf was the first act of entry into Eretz Canaan, and therefore it was appropriate for them to be formatted the way they would enter Eretz Canaan, as to their own Shvatim, each entering the Yam Suf with their own pathway through it. This is an amazing idea. Thank you for seeing it all the way through. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week.